Buying second-hand PCs can be a germaphobe's worst nightmare. For every conscientious seller diligently applying some tech yes loving to their used builds before carefully shipping them off to their new owners, there's another jackass who just slings out their old rig in a cardboard box and, I was going to say washes their hands of it, but yeah, maybe not. This PC is most definitely the latter. The previous owner, also known as Patient Zero, built a mid to high-end gaming rig in 2012, featuring an i7, 24GB of RAM, and a decent GPU for the time, before forgetting to clean it for the rest of the decade. Will I still get a decent gaming experience from this 10-year-old PC in 2022, or just a case of tuberculosis? CEX are notorious among British PC nerds. I've been a regular customer for over 20 years. In general, I've been very satisfied with my purchases, however I've had just enough negative experiences to think twice before buying a whole PC from them. After all, what is a PC if not a collection of potential technical faults in a steel case? And when there are no photos or detailed specs to guide you, it can be something of a crapshoot. What's different this time? Well, maybe I've had a change of heart about the whole thing. Maybe this was just an incredible bargain that I couldn't let get away. Or maybe Greg Salazar's most viewed videos are him cleaning out old PCs, and I want to get some of that sweet PC-DC traffic. We may never know the truth. This PC was described on Secks' site as a custom build using an i7-3820, 24GB of RAM, a 120GB hard drive, and a GTX 670 for the fairly reasonable price of £220 delivered. And that's all I had to go on. I could make some educated guesses about what might actually be inside the PC, but without pictures or details, I was left with more questions. What kind of motherboard does it have? Is it a genuine X79, a repurposed server board, or an AliExpress special? How exactly does that 24GB of RAM break down? Is it 2 4GB and 2 8GB sticks, or 3 8GBs, or 1 8 and 1 16? What power supply does it have? What case? What cooling? 120GB sounds like an SSD capacity rather than a hard drive, and if so, then an error like that should make me question the competence of the people selling it. Should I really be getting myself into this? So yes, I admit I ignored a few glaring red flags, and honestly I can't wholeheartedly recommend buying something like this yourself unless you have a local store to return them to, but Secks have been pretty good at honouring their 24-month warranty in the past, so with my money relatively safe, I decided to go out on a limb and risk my time and potentially my respiratory health. And a great deal of time later, here she is, my big old Dirty CEX Machine. On first inspection, things are looking promising. The case is a mid to high-end Cooler Master HAF 912, in pretty good condition, but missing the front feet, and the I/O panel indicates this probably isn't a server board or AliExpress model. I can also see that the PSU is a Corsair TX650, which was a perfectly good 80 plus bronze PSU in its day. I think I might have struck lucky this time. My best possible scenario for this build before seeing it was that it was some enthusiast's old 2012 gaming rig that had been traded in wholesale, and this would appear to be the case. Speaking of cases, the screws holding the near side panel on were non-original silver Phillips heads that I quickly swapped out for some spare thumb screws I had lying around. With the panel off, I could now see a shitload of dust. Yes, the previous owner had not only not upgraded their system much in a decade, they don't appear to have cleaned it either, and the Secks store that purchased it either didn't look, or they did look and said, yeah, this is fine. Looking past the dust bunnies, however, I can see a few things that are keeping my hopes up. First, the heatsink appears to be some variant of a Hyper 212, which gained something of a cult following over the last decade or so. The motherboard model was obscured, but I recognise the font and general design as being a Gigabyte, but I'll find out for sure when I take out the graphics card. That, incidentally, is an EVGA FTW GTX 670 with 2GB of VRAM and a blower-style cooler. Nothing earth-shattering, and probably won't run as cool and quiet as the Asus model I used to own, but better clocked than your average 670. Sadly, it's not a 4GB model, but the lack of driver support and DX12 on Kepler cards already make this a shaky prospect for the latest games. The system RAM is populating all 4 channels, and consists of a pair of 4GB Corsair Vengeance along with a pair of 8GB green PCB sticks from Patriot, installed in what I believe to be the wrong slots. The bigger problem though is the storage. As I'd guessed, the 120GB drive is a 2.5-inch HyperX SATA SSD, and there's an unexpected 1TB WD Black hard drive in there too. However, for all the care and attention paid to the external packaging, there was nothing inside the PC to prevent things shifting in transit. This means the drive sleds have collapsed, possibly due to some kind of impact, and I don't have particularly high hopes that the hard drive will have survived. This isn't a major issue, as I have a few spare drives around that could replace it, but the lack of internal packing lends more credence to my theory that the store never even looked inside this PC before they bought it. I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if they didn't have a Phillips screwdriver to get the side panel off, which would be inexcusable. Most CEX stores are on UK high streets, so surely they have a Wilkinson or Poundland or something nearby. After a cursory power on to make sure everything was in working order, I went about cleaning out the grime of a decade's worth of hard labour. After getting the RAM installed into more appropriate slots, repasting the CPU and GPU, wiping the caked on dust from the fans, and doing a bare minimum in the way of cable management, I'll be the first to admit it's not quite worthy of being called a PC deep clean. There's still some work to be done before it's ready to be resold. I'll have to pick up some new case feet and wash some of the mesh filters, and the case's lack of 2.5-inch drive support means I'll have to pick up some kind of caddy, but the truth is that this isn't the CEX Machine's final form. I'll talk a little more about that later, but for the time being, here's what I'm sure you've all been waiting for. 10 years ago, if you were building this system for high-end gaming, chances are that 2011's Skyrim was high on your list of priorities. With its huge open world and decent graphics for the time, Bethesda's now legendary RPG was a real workout for the PCs of the day. At 1080 Ultra settings, the CEX Machine manages an exceptionally healthy 98 FPS, though lows were less impressive. The cutting edge of 2012 open world gaming was moving fast. Batman Arkham City was another game that made its way into new CPU and GPU reviews of the era, and it seems to have been quite a lot more demanding than other games, thanks in no small part to being one of the few titles to support NVIDIA PhysX. At high settings with PhysX enabled, the game runs just a little below the 60 FPS cap on average, dropping to 40 FPS in intensive action scenes. I dare say turning PhysX off would probably stabilise things a bit. Naturally, if you spent big money on a PC like this one, you'd reasonably expect it to still give a AAA gaming experience 12 months later. 2013's Tomb Raider reboot was all over hardware benchmarks for years, and this PC has absolutely no problem running at 1080 Ultra settings. Averages hit about 75 FPS with lows in the high 40s. Although it marked the beginning of a critical slump for the series, 2014's Advanced Warfare was a bit of a technical challenge compared to previous Calls of Duty. Although playing on high settings seems possible, it doesn't take long for things to get bogged down as the GPU runs out of VRAM. With a couple of compromises to texture streaming and shadows, it averages an impressive 80 FPS, but lows of 30 don't do much for playability. Some more quality adjustments may be required to guarantee a smooth experience. 3 years into its lifespan and the CEX Machine was still putting up a fight. Witcher 3 can be extremely demanding, but the i7 and GTX 670 proved able to hold their own. Third-person RPGs are less reliant on high FPS, and especially so if you use a controller. The near 50 FPS average this PC managed to achieve is definitely tolerable, even playable, but bear in mind some of the more intensive city scenes will probably drag minimums below 30. There's room to drop to low or maybe drop resolution if necessary, but on the whole this is a pretty good compromise. Sticking with 2015 titles for a moment, mainly because YouTube seems obsessed with it, GTA 5 scales nicely with older hardware, and it's not really surprising that this system can give a good experience. Better than good, in fact. At 1080 high, with softer shadows and a slight dip in crowd variety to keep within the VRAM limit, I saw 80 FPS with lows barely dipping below 60. It seems like the previous owner of this PC got to enjoy at least a few years of good gaming experiences, potentially including some absolute modern classics. You might ask what made them choose this moment to sell. Well, I have a few ideas about that. Trying to start Elden Ring and... oh dear. God of War? I don't think we'll have much luck with Halo Infinite or Forza Horizon 5 either. Cyberpunk 2077, however, actually works, after a fashion. At 1920 by 1080, medium quality with quality FSR, it managed to hit about 20 FPS, and low quality only brings that up to 22. The CPU is being taxed heavily, but the GPU is still the limiting factor, so dropping to FSR balance can push to about 27 FPS. That also happens to be the same as the Vega 11 integrated GPU on a Ryzen 3400G scored, only at FSR quality. Oops. Modern AAAs are just not in this PC's wheelhouse. That doesn't mean you're stuck playing oldies for the rest of its life. This system still has enough performance where it counts that you could be stuck playing eSports for the rest of its life. Apex isn't a hard game to run in the grand scheme of things, but for older and low-end PCs, it still needs a bit more GPU performance than the GTX 670 can provide. To get an acceptable frame rate, I had to drop quality settings almost as low as they'd go, and resolution to 1280 by 720, but that did manage to give an 80 FPS average and 53 FPS 1% low. This gives a reasonably responsive experience, but I do hate playing BRs at 720. It makes finding targets a bit of a ball ache. At Pro settings, Fortnite's working pretty well, all things considered. Harder core gamers will want to play in performance mode, but to make sure I'm giving the GPU a proper workout, I like to test in regular rendering. In this case though, I did try both DX11 and DX12 to see if there was an obvious winner. DX11 gives an 81 FPS average at 1080 low with epic view distance, whereas DX12 almost reaches 94. That's not quite the whole story though, as the 1% lows on both were horrific, with DX12s being far worse overall. Performance does generally tend to improve if you play multiple matches in a row, as the game has time to build its shader cache, but I wasn't really up for putting the time in to find out if things got any better. Valorant gets CPU bottlenecked very easily, as I found out last year when my Ryzen 3 3100 held back every graphics card to about 170 to 180 FPS. This makes Valorant a great CPU benchmark, and you'll definitely see this title featuring in my CPU reviews starting in the next few weeks. As a kind of teaser for that, the i7-3820 manages an average just over 144 FPS at 1080 high. This is pretty interesting, as the last quad-core of this generation I tested was the Xeon E3-1240, which, with about 300 to 400 MHz lower clocks and only dual-channel RAM, scored 40 FPS lower. The numbers here are actually closer to a first-gen quad-core Ryzen, like the one in my £420 PC from 2021. In the same vein, CSGO can also be held back by a weak CPU. While this is technically a period-appropriate game for a 2012-era PC, it's had some work done in the last decade, and no longer runs like it used to. At 1080 low though, it's still possible to have a good time with this PC, with an average just a little below 200 FPS and 1% lows of about 90. Arguably good enough for competitive play, but more than enough for a casual gamer who enjoys being demolished by far superior players. Thanks to the Wayback Machine, I was able to find almost all the component prices from late 2012 on the cached version of scan.co.uk, one of the major PC retailers here in the UK. I tallied everything up to about £1,100, meaning it's lost 80% of its value in the last decade. Now, it wouldn't be unfair to say that a PC with this level of performance isn't really worth £220 these days. Last year I featured a £150 build with another 4-core 8-thread multiplier locked Sandy Bridge CPU and a GTX 670. Except for having 3 times the RAM and a nicer PSU, this PC's performance doesn't look to be worth £70 more than that one. Well, the difference isn't so much in what it can do, but what it could do. That previous build was cobbled together out of low-end and X-server parts, and the CPU was one of the highest-end options that motherboard could accommodate, whereas X79 was an enthusiast-grade platform with the potential for some very serious expansion. The i7-3820 was the entry-level Socket 2011 CPU. X79 motherboards can support up to 6-core i7 Extremes and 12-core Xeons, which promise to make this much more competitive than mainstream 2nd, 3rd or even 4th generation Intel desktop chips, and can even be compared to early Ryzen. In the future, I'm going to revisit the CEX Machine with a few choice upgrades, so let me know in the comments which CPU and GPU I should get. One last thing before I sign off, this video wouldn't have been possible without donations through Super Thanks and Patreon. I'd like to thank patrons Kumar, Dom and Joe, as well as Wizzy, TechDweeb and Dammit Jeff. I truly appreciate the support. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.